Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Democracy That Delivers podcast. My name is Michelle Crimes, and I am a CIPE Anti-Corruption and Governance Center Program Officer. And I am joined today by my guests, Walter and Magdalena. Today, we're going to be talking about anti-corruption and ESG standards. Walter and Magdalena are experts in ESG standards. They engage a lot of work about understanding ESG standards in the markets, and they've done a lot of really amazing work, and we're hoping to have a conversation with them today. As many of us know, stock exchanges can really play a critical role in encouraging the adoption of responsible and transparent business practices by supporting issuers. And we're going to have a little bit of conversation. ESG is very popular at the moment. It's a topic that many people are interested in. But one of the things that we realize is that sometimes we are talking about very different things. And so this will be a conversation to help us maybe get on the same page on the topic. So with that, I'm going to welcome my guests, Walter and Magdalena.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Fantastic. We're really glad to have you. So as I was saying in the introduction, we know that ESG often gets confused with sustainability goals, with, perhaps just behaving properly for a business. It's not the same thing in every conversation. So we know that ESG stands for Environment, Social, and Governance Standards, but what does that mean? I wonder if either of you might sort of give me your opinion or where you stand on what ESG means.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is also something that we get quite a lot, that there is no one definition of ESG. And perhaps if you would ask 10 people in the room to say what it means to them, you would get 10 different answers. That's how different it can be depending on the person, whether that's a company, whether that's investors, whether that's someone else. It can mean really a lot of things. To us, I think, so before ESG, we had this concept CSR, right? The corporate social responsibility. That was really the precursor to ESG. And it really started because there was a growing recognition among the society and the companies as well that business should take ownership of the impact on the society or be more socially accountable. So back then, all those activities around CSR were a bit more on the social side of things, and they typically were more external than internal, which means that companies were focusing how they can have some positive impact outside of their organization rather than looking inside how they are managing their workforces, their supply chain, etc. So there was a lot of focus on activities such as philanthropy and volunteering. And with time, of course, the environmental issues as well were added to this broad spectrum of CSR activities. However, they tend to be not part of the core business processes or the core business strategy. And then I think around 25 years later, around mid-20s, the term ESG was coined, and it actually came in response to this rise in the responsible investing, or ESG investing, as we call it nowadays. And investors really wanted to be able to measure in somewhat more structured way how companies are managing this broad spectrum of environmental, social, and governance issues, whether that's GHG emissions or the resources used, how they are approaching the waste generation and trying to reduce that, or supply chains diversity and inclusion, and many other topics. So ESG is definitely something much more strategic in nature. It's not a side activity as it was in many cases with the CSR. It's more embedded into the core business strategy and risk management of the company. And I think another important differentiator or a factor that helps to understand ESG a bit better is that because it came in response to a lot of the investor expectations, we know investors has this preference for quantitative information. So it was much more about the numbers and the data. And I remember reading somewhere that the ESG is a financialization of sustainability. And I think there is a lot of truth in this, because it's much more about the matrix and data, so measuring the sustainability performance in quantitative terms.
I was sort of writing down as you were talking, sort of the emphasis on the numbers and the data, right? And that's sort of what's really important. And I think what makes this conversation important is because we're starting to talk about what are the numbers, what are the data, and under realizing that perhaps we're not all sort of talking about the same thing again. And that's just not, there's communities such as you both who understand sort of what you mean. But as we sort of expand more and even talk in different part of the world, different regions throughout the world, that sort of how ESG is understood is slightly a bit different. Walter, did you have something you wanted to add?
I think that Magdalena gave a very good overview of what ESG is and how this term also, I think, was coined by investors. And that immediately brings us to, let's say, data and a business case, right? So where I think that, and what Magdalena already said, CSR was not the core business. So it's more like the voluntary and the charity kind of thing. And you can argue that a company should not be doing that, right? So especially in the American context, you say that you're working with shareholders' money and that should be spent wisely, invested wisely. So, and I think that with ESG, it's basically about how do you integrate sustainability in your core business and how do you make sure that there is a business case and that investors will be willing to invest in your business plans that will help your company to make money for both the organization as well as contribute a positive thing to society, right? So, for example, the transition towards more renewable energy or more responsible supply chains or that kind of thing, where not just the company has a benefit, but also other stakeholders and society at large.
No, great. Thank you for sort of expanding on that a bit. I think one of the things that sort of hits me as I have this conversation repeatedly with people about what is ESG is that we know there are sort of different standards, right? And so there are these sort of non-financial reporting standards, and then there are voluntary standards. I'd be really curious to hear how you both sort of understand the different types of ESG standards, and then sort of what's the difference between the reporting standards and then voluntary standards.
Right. So yeah, this is a very complex topic at the moment because we've seen the proliferation of those different standards, and it's easy to get lost with all of them because we have so many. I think you pointed that right, that we have these voluntary standards that companies have been using to inform their stakeholders how they are managing different ESG issues. And there are those regulatory frameworks, right, that made it a requirement for certain companies to disclose some ESG information. So in the European Union, in Europe, that's, for example, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, the NFRD in short. And at the moment, this targets around 12,000 companies. However, as it's being revised now, it will expand and it will be also replaced. The name will change. It will be Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And as of 2025, indicatively, because the timelines are still to be confirmed, this number of companies that will have to report on ESG issues will likely to quadruple. So there is a lot of regulatory push to increase this transparency and availability of ESG data. And we see that not only in Europe, but also in other geographies. In the US, you probably recognize that this is a very hot topic now at the moment with the SEC proposing the climate disclosure rules. So there is a lot of push from the regulators to somehow help companies improve the consistency and the quality of data and make investors more help them to use this data in a more confident way. Because what we've seen now is that we had all those voluntary frameworks and standards, and that gave the companies the flexibility to kind of use them how they wanted. Therefore, the data was not always easy to compare. It was inconsistent. We had some data gaps. So it was not really an investor-grade data. But let me also give you a quick rundown of all those voluntary frameworks, because this is also a very interesting space at the moment. We've seen a lot of changes happening last year. So I like to think about the standards that can be used to report on a broad range of ESG issues. And these are the ones that probably a lot of people recognize, such as the GRI and SASB standards, and also the integrated reporting framework. And they really help companies to report on all sorts of ESG issues. And then we have those frameworks that are more specific to topic. So we have, for example, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure Recommendations, which has emerged to be a golden standard for reporting on climate change issues. So they just focus on climate change. And then recently we had a new initiative coming up, the TNFD, which another acronym that we can add to this ESG alphabet soup that we have. This stands for the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and it will be very similar to what the TCFD is doing. It will focus, though, on the nature-related risks, so the risk around biodiversity. So I think these are the kind of standards that companies have been using so far on a voluntary basis. And it doesn't mean that the company has to use one standard. A lot of the times companies use 2 or 3 different standards. So it's very difficult for companies to for the new companies, for those that start to report, to wrap their head around all those standards and understand which are relevant to them.
No, well, I mean, if I hear Magdalena tell this and anticipating that you have an audience that is not so much into sustainability or ESG reporting, I mean, they must be very confused by now, right? So I think that a very important advice I would have for a company is to really consider why would you want to report on this. I mean, apparently these standards and the drive for transparency is really pushing the ESG agenda, right? So I mean, you could also just legislate what you have to do, but apparently a lot of people hope that through reporting, through increased transparency, things will change. And still, companies have to wonder, why would I want to disclose what? And what audience am I serving? Otherwise, you're just going to drown and get lost in all these standards and all these possibilities. And you can study this for ages without doing anything, right? So I would really advise your audience to be a bit pragmatic and think about what they stand for and find the kind of standard or guideline or whatever support mechanism they can think of that help them to convey their ambition and message to their specific target audience. Otherwise, it's going to be a horrible kind of encyclopedia of everything you do without anybody recognizing the added value of that.
Right. So as I'm sort of listening to both of you talk, I have sort of 2 questions come to mind. So I'll say what they both are, and then maybe we can talk about both of them. So one is sort of harmonization of standards. That's a big thing that we're talking about. How do we all get on the same page? How do we make sure suddenly that we're all talking about the same thing when right now, clearly we haven't? And then the second is sort of the business case. So I'll give you a chance to sort of respond to the first question sort of about standardization and then come back to the business case question.
So I can start on the harmonization because I also feel that it's very much needed. It's a very timely initiative to start harmonizing all those standards and frameworks that are out there. And thankfully, there are some initiatives that just started to happening that are looking exactly at that. So the first one is the IFRS Foundation that was announced last year. And what they are trying to do, they created the International Sustainability Standard Board, the ISSB, which will develop the global sustainability disclosure standards for capital markets. So this will be very similar to what the IFRS accounting standards have done for the financial reporting, right? So this is the first initiative that is looking globally at how we can harmonize all those initiatives that has been out there already that companies have been using and create something that is more of a common language to everyone. So what they are thinking about doing is not to create something completely new to build from scratch, not at all. They will use the existing standards and frameworks and build on top of that. So they will consolidate the SASB and the IRC, which are now merged under the Value Reporting Foundation, as well as the Climate Disclosure Standard Board framework, and will try to together come up with this new standard. And I think we can expect something, already the first standards to be available this year, but they will only become binding after they will be adopted by different jurisdictions. So it will take some time before they will be actually enforced and used by the companies. And we have another similar initiatives happening in Europe, which is more of it's more driven by the regulations here in Europe, by the directives that require companies to report on ESG. And there we have the European Commission asking the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, the EFRAG, to develop the sustainability reporting standards that will be mandatory for all those companies that fall under the directive, the new Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that requires reporting of those information. So for those companies, there will be no other options. I guess they could still use some other avenues of communication on sustainability issues, but if they fall under the scope of the directive, they will have a very precise set of guidelines or standards to use to report those information. And the GRI, another big standard setter, will assist EFRAG in this process. So I think we are seeing two big initiatives that are trying to harmonize it. Big question is now, will they work together? They say they will, to make sure that, we are not creating two different sets of standards, one for Europe and one for the rest of the world, but that those standards are really aligned, at least on the key issues. So let's see where we go with this. We know that when the regulators tackle the reporting and try to harmonize, sometimes we get something that is even more complicated than we had in the beginning. But fingers crossed. I think these are really good initiatives and something to move into direction of having more clarity of what companies should disclose and being that the same thing for all the companies.
And sort of speaking to your point of let's see, as regulators try to harmonize, what happens from that. I think one of the things that we've talked about before is that we're also sort of talking about different regions of the world sort of approaching this in different ways. So for example, in Europe, it's just different than what happens in the US, where we're very rules-based, right? Whereas sort of what's happening in Europe is a very different approach. I wonder, Walter, if you have any thoughts about that to sort of share. I know you have thoughts, so that's why I wanted to ask you to share with us what you think about that and what that might mean for standardizing.
The harmonization is key. Let's face it, you need a baseline of definition and standards and provide guidance to companies, because not all executives in companies, and if you talk bigger companies, will feel the need to embrace sustainability or ESG by themselves. And also there, the difference between, let's say, the American shareholder model or the more like European Rhinelander stakeholder model, right? So in Europe, there's this tendency that you have to work with stakeholders a bit more than in the US. In the US, it's much more rules-based than the Europe, where you have a lot of principle-based kind of regulations. Although everything is more also here. We are in a global world, so these things are getting closer to each other. So it's not as clear-cut as I seem to suggest. The point with harmonization and waiting for regulators to act, I think is not a reason to sit back as a company. If you do recognize the business case, which I just discussed, and if you do recognize the need to build bridges to your stakeholders, and that you recognize that you, for example, need young people in the war for talent. Why would young people work for you? More and more research is saying that they want to work for a big company that has a purpose and that contributes also to society at large. If you do recognize that your consumers are moving into the direction of more responsible consuming, or NGOs that are getting more vocal, there's an inherent kind of business case to report on your sustainability performance. So even if standards or definitions are not as clear-cut as you would hope, you can act. And what we are seeing is that the frontrunners in sustainability and in ESG, they don't wait for perfect definitions. They don't need perfect definitions and standards. They just start and they pioneer this, and they learn by doing. Whereas others that claim to need perfect definitions and perfect standards first, will always find an excuse to ask for more and continue business as regular, business as they were used to. So for them, it's also an excuse not to get out of their comfort zones. Well, it's not a surprise to you, but being active in sustainability for more than 20 years, I really support the kind of entrepreneurs or executives that dare to stand out and dare to embrace the challenge of sustainability and ESG reporting, although standards are not perfect and although definitions are still developing. And that makes this a very interesting terrain with lots of dilemmas.
Right. And so let's talk a little bit about the dilemmas. Sort of as you were speaking there, sort of this general categories of companies who are comfortable going for it. They see the importance, they move forward. And then you sort of have companies who are the other side who may be more hesitant, they want more information. What do you think sort of drives that? And based on your understanding of what drives that, what do you think the big challenges are sort of in moving past that, particularly the second potential group of companies?
This is a very hard question. I think a part of what drives this is the character of a company. I mean, is it capital intensive? If you invested massively in plants or in a production facility, for example, if you have a big oil drilling site and you've invested massively in that, it's harder to change your business than when you're capital light and more like, say, people-intensive company. Then it's easier to adapt, maybe to new circumstances. The question is always, I mean, who is paying for the change, right? So if your consumer is not willing to pay a higher price, and if the government is not pushing, well, maybe here regulations are pushing you to upgrade your facility, to reduce your footprint, but you don't see the benefit. There is no benefit. You only see increased cost. It's hard for companies to change. Not all the investors will support the kind of change if they see their returns diminished. So it is indeed a very hard nut to crack. Then again, if you look a little bit more into the future, so let's say 5 or 10 years from now, with climate change getting more a dominant factor on the agenda of businesses, society is getting more vocal about labor rights, about union rights, for example. I mean, there's some interesting cases also in the US now about having a union or not in a company, about supply chains, resourcing, reshoring. I mean, there's all kinds of, let's say, societal dilemmas that are on the plate of executives and entrepreneurs. So if you can avoid making a change now for whatever reason, I'm pretty sure that this will be harder in a few years from now, because these kind of developments that we're seeing, I think, are likely to be increasing. So it feels a bit like a pressure cooker that a lot of companies are in, because the world is pretty dynamic at the moment.
So I have a bit of a follow-up to my question, sort of, because you've sort of jumped right into what the potential challenges are and why the delay. I think that there is skepticism about ESG, right? I know folks who are, well, this is going to pass. It's a fad. It's just, it's just interesting for now, and this is going to maybe perhaps go away. But I wonder if maybe you could speak to that a little bit. Is ESG just the current sort of investment standard fad, or is this something that's here to stay? And I'd be curious to know why you think it's something that's here to stay.
My first take is, yes, it's a development. So it's been going through waves, right? It has its ups and its downs. I think a few years ago, in 2018 or something, 2019, the Financial Times, for example, was very vocal about ESG and sustainability and how it would change the markets. Whereas over the last few weeks, I've seen some critical analysis of ESG saying that indeed there's too much greenwash, there's too much groupthink, et cetera, et cetera. So there's also criticism about ESG. And I think that's logical, given the phase we're in, right? So to me, ESG or sustainability is here to stay because of what I just said about societal developments that are pushing the business agenda harder and harder. And it is increasingly important for entrepreneurs and executives to manage those kind of pressures successfully. So whether you call it ESG or enlightened self-interest or sustainability, I don't know. But you have to manage your stakeholders much more transparently and effectively than you might have used to. So I don't think that, let's say, the thinking behind ESG is going to away, but there will be a lot of criticism, and maybe the words will change and the thinking will change and the processes will be beefed up, and that's necessary. But I think this is just a next step in the development. I don't know, Magda, is that also what you would say?
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree 100%. I don't think it's something that is going to go away. In fact, I think a lot of the reason why it's becoming so important and why, it's difficult to avoid is also because the ESG investing, the investors they are interested in those kind of information. They want to have more transparency from companies, and the ESG investing is growing a lot and very rapidly. And, it shows no signs of stopping. In fact, the predictions say that it will become a new norm for investing, like to integrate the ESG criteria into the investments processes. So, the investors are requiring this higher level of transparency from the companies to be able to make their decisions based on that, and also to be able to maybe redirect their capital towards more sustainable activities, like we've seen the taxonomies and all the new things that has emerged. that were basically a tool to redirect the capital towards those sustainable activities, and also to kind of prevent greenwashing or create a standard that will help us distinguish between the real good, the real green activities and those that maybe are not so much. So I think that's also pushing this trend a lot. And that's really an opportunity for companies, I would say, to demonstrate that the value they're creating with their sustainability strategies and programs. And if they are not disclosing those information if they are not providing this level of transparency, that also sends not very positive signal to the market. So I think, we have those forces pushing from different directions, whether that's societal demands, whether that's investors, the regulators, that really makes this trend, the ESG, to stay with us for a long time.
Thank you both for that. I think I agree with you wholeheartedly. One of the ways that I try to talk about this is that saying, I think you've said transparency, which is great, because we know transparency is something that once we sort of have it, it's very difficult to sort of pull back from that. And I also sort of talk about it in terms of multidimensionals, right? It's not just sort of looking at balancing, what are the numbers look like? There are these new sort of factors that our ESG bring in, can allow us to see transparency, right? And so I think that perhaps, Walter, you might be correct. Maybe we'll see it evolve. Maybe it's going to become something different. Maybe it'll change names. So maybe it won't be ESG, 5 years from now. Maybe it will be something different. But I certainly think this sort of multi-dimensional approach to sort of understanding what is happening with the business and how they're impacting the communities where they're interacting is something that is probably here to stay. I think that this is all the time that we have, and so we need to wrap up. I want to thank you both for really having a great conversation. As I've said before, we do a lot of talking here at SIPE within ACGC about what is ESG. We think it's really important, and conversations like these really shed light on what's to come. And we'll just leave it with saying that ESG is perhaps here to stay. And I appreciate both of your time today, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit sipe.org.